truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Thursday, September 5th, 2024, the 1324th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so you may have heard we have now entered the phase of Russian Collusion Hoax number 2. And the most important pattern to understand as we watch this play out is that every one of these major, supposedly pro-Trump interference scandals always falls flat on its face. And then you add to that the pattern that's been repeating over these past couple of years, showing that every attempt to get Trump ends up backfiring and indicting the people trying to get Trump. And of course, as we come to the end of this phase, if you imagined that on a timeline, and then you folded that timeline back onto itself from the end of 2020, I am fairly certain you would see considerable overlap in all of those narratives. The narratives that were seeded through the primary process of 2015 and the election process of 2016 are now coming back fully into view. As we're seeing it right now, the regime is accusing Trump of various crimes, Russian collusion, people around Trump colluding with Russia, working on Russia's behalf, trying to rig this election in favor of Donald Trump. The accusations are weak and almost nonsensical, but in that regard, this is the same as what happened back in 2016. It's the regime accusing Trump of all sorts of collusion, trying to rig an election on his own behalf. But the arguments they're making this time around are actually condemnations of themselves. They are accusing Trump of things that they have provably done and that the public, by and large, already knows about, to the point where when each individual issue and aspect presents itself in the public conversation, there will be an immediate backlash to whatever point they're intending to make. They have already done the bad thing that they are accusing Trump of doing. And when the anti-Trump stories go out from the mainstream media outlets, social media will quickly embarrass and shame all the people who are sharing it. That advantage flipped to our side a long time ago, and now the accusations against Trump and all of these stories are becoming more and more ridiculous. We just had the mainstream media telling us yesterday that this Hunter Biden tax evasion trial was going to have all of the salacious details coming out. This was going to be such a salacious trial. And now he's agreeing to a plea deal. So there won't be a trial. And in all likelihood, he made this plea deal many years ago and has just been an informant the whole time. Does that mean he's a good guy and didn't do the things he did? No, it doesn't mean that at all. But it does mean that we're watching a reenactment. We were intentionally put behind on an informational timeline. These facts would have become true 4, 5, or 6 years ago, and we would only be finding out that they are quote unquote true now. And most of the people who argued that none of this was true will still believe that's the case. So the issue largely disappears, just like Hunter's dad, Joe Biden. Oh, no, wait, Joe's going to go give a major economic speech this afternoon. Trump just gave an extremely serious, detailed, professional speech in front of the Economic Club of New York, but Joe Biden is going to go give a major economic address this afternoon. Yeah, that's going to happen. All of this is very real. It's playing out spontaneously. Everybody is acting in their own best interest, and it just so happens that Joe Biden is giving an economic address the same day Trump gave one, while Joe Biden isn't even running in the fake election, and Kamala Harris, who they're saying is running, doesn't have any policies. How is that, by the way? It's almost like they're telling you, hey, this is a fake campaign. Do you get it yet? But let's spend at least a little time with the beginnings of Russian Collusion Hoax number 2, and it stars 3 of the most dishonest, griftiest frauds in the uniparty right info op: Dave Rubin, Tim Pool, and Benny Johnson. Rubin and Pool are liberals. They both supported Ron DeSantis, but they're liberals. They've always been liberals. Tim Pool was a Bernie bro. He's mildly pro-Trump sometimes, but from a clueless normie perspective now, Dave Rubin is a gay dad who used to work for the totally commie Young Turks, then worked for Larry King for a little while, and then began doing a podcast where he would interview all of the same people that are basically still in this info op. The intellectual dark web was essentially spawned from Dave Rubin's podcast. Dave Rubin was the guy who was famous for branding, "I didn't leave the left left me." He has pretended for many years to be a stand-up comedian, and he used to do 5 minutes of stand-up opening for Jordan Peterson at his live tours And during that time, he would essentially just do Jordan Peterson's lines and pretend that they're jokes. Larry Elder went on his podcast once and convinced Dave that he was wrong about racism, and from then on, Dave Rubin referred to himself as a classical liberal, which you're supposed to distinguish completely from the wokes and the communists and the globalists in general, because his opinions and their opinions differ by a small matter of degrees, and therefore, in the child brain, they're not the same thing. He now presents himself as a die-hard conserva bro that also just happened to purchase 2 babies with his friend. Benny Johnson was always a liberal. He used to work for BuzzFeed. He was ejected from BuzzFeed for plagiarism. Now he does totally normie, grifty, influency, pro-Trump content, much of which he rips off from other people without crediting them. So Benny presents as pro-Trump. Dave Rubin presents as formerly pro-Trump, now mostly anti-Trump, but he'll do it out of necessity. And Tim Pool was basically never Trump, who's now pro-Trump sometimes. He's actually too good for Trump, but he'll consider voting for Trump out of necessity. Strangely, a big portion of MAGA sees these people as being on our side. And hey, maybe they are. Maybe we might find that out at the end, but they're not now. And people say, yes, but they're staying back to wake up the normies. Okay, have they done that? I would suggest that they have not. And if it turns out that they are, it is still not our responsibility to stay back and wait for the normies. That doesn't mean we can't be there for them. If there are close friends or family, of course, be there for the people who are close to you. If they have questions, answer their questions honestly and to the best of your ability, and say you don't know when you don't know. But the rest of the time, keep moving ahead, because somebody's going to have to be up ahead so that they can see the normies in quotes, that there is someone ahead, someone who has already modeled their path, someone who can show them, hey, it's actually all right up here. You can change your mind about that. We're all good. Don't worry about that. Just change your mind and start catching up. But that doesn't exist because we are too concerned about waking up the normies. Brett Weinstein, a member of the intellectual dark web, as named by Barry Weiss in the pages of the New York Times, she said, these are society's new intellectual renegades. These people were presented as this buzzing hive of counter-narrative thought. You got to get on the same page as these guys. If you hate what the mainstream media is selling you, just wait till you try intellectual dark web from the makers of, hey, that's a conspiracy theory. Now, many of these people were very serious intellectuals, but some of them were podcast hosts. Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, and then, of course, Ben Shapiro, who is not only a podcast host, he's also a very serious intellectual, and probably Mossad. All of these people, of course, take themselves very seriously. Barry Weiss wrote her article in May of 2018, and Eric Weinstein had come up with the term before that. But we are well over 6 years into the intellectual dark web, and the very same people are still at the very front of the very same conversation. And people are monitoring that conversation or entertaining themselves with that conversation on the exact same platforms as before. In 2020, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, all of those were censored platforms. Content would be labeled. Content would be taken down. Content makers and even content sharers would be banned from the platforms completely, making it so that everyone still on the platform doesn't get to hear from those people. It's not just about those people being able to have the platform. It's about everybody else on the platform getting a whole range of ideas rather than only the range the platform accepts. Yet all of these members of the intellectual dark web and all of the people in that broader community were never censored. Sure, censorship was threatened, but they accepted the incentive and punishment structure because they wanted to continue reaping the rewards, which include making, for many of them, tens of millions of dollars a year. I don't make tens of millions of dollars a year. I'm censored, I'm shadow banned, I'm kept off platforms intentionally, and we have virtually no business model because companies are leveraged and influenced out of doing business with us. For instance, putting advertisements near our content. We might help them make money, but they can't do it because they know they'll be attacked. And these people thrive in that environment. Dave Rubin, Benny Johnson, Tim Pool, they're major players in that environment, seen to be by many people as very reasonable, rational, Trump-friendly allies of ours. Except all of these people have ignored for nearly 4 years now the fact that Joe Biden did not receive 81 million real lawful American votes and is not a legitimate president. Donald Trump never conceded, and 2020 is unresolved. World leaders do not look at the fake President Joe Biden and the fake Vice President Kamala Harris and take them seriously because they know they're not the legitimate President and Vice President of the United States. They do business with Donald Trump. Not only in understanding the world we are in, but understanding the world ahead, that is the most pertinent fact in all of politics. And it has been totally avoided by all of the people in mainstream media, including and especially all of these people who pretend to know what's going on in a Trump positive way. Because they have ignored that fact, every bit of analysis and understanding derived downstream from that fundamental misunderstanding is necessarily wrong. It is almost impossible in that situation to be correct. And if it turns out that you are correct, it is probably by accident or coincidence because they have not incorporated that fact and they don't want to present themselves as liars or clueless. They have gone on pretending that it's not a fact and have constructed for themselves an entire false reality of convoluted and complicated explanations about how somehow the elections are rigged, but not in the ways that the conspiracy theorists think. Except they're wrong about that. The elections are rigged in those ways. And in fact, the deeper understanding is not that the elections are rigged, it's that we don't have elections. The choices are made well beyond the people's input. They select the candidates to run, they rig primaries, and then they rig general elections. Listening to these people talk about elections is like listening to the COVID experts who told you it would help to wear 2 masks in your car. If they know what they're talking about at all, then they're lying. It's actually better for them to plead ignorance, except they can't do that because then that destroys their reputation as the very serious intellectuals of the intellectual dark web and YouTube podcast fame. These are the most important people to ever speak anywhere about anything. That's why they get $1 million a week from the regime to tell everyone else what to think. You can watch them immediately adopt entirely new vocabularies. Everybody now calls the deep state, or perhaps what they understand to be the global deep state, the blob, because Mike Benz has popularized that term. And it's a fine term. But it's not a new concept to us. We don't need to change our language to describe it. But before we get into Benny and Tim and Dave, I want to play this clip of Brett Weinstein on Joe Rogan. It is now official Joe Rogan conversation to talk about how our elections are stolen, as long as you don't say anything correct about it. This was posted on X, formerly Twitter, by an account that goes by @FisherKing64, Fisher with a C between the S and the H. And I followed this account here and there while I was on Twitter. He presents himself as an extremely serious intellectual. But in his caption with the video I'm about to play, he says Brett Weinstein explained succinctly today on Rogan how our voting system is designed to be gamed. His point about exit polling is a particularly good one. If in-person voting isn't the exclusive method, exit polling cannot be used to detect fraud, and that's not an accident. Except exit polling isn't used to detect fraud. Exit polling is used to support fraud in a narrative sense. Exit polling says there were people outside some of the polls asking some of the people what they voted for. and then they tally those very serious data up, and then they stick that data into models, or they adjust it in whatever ways they need to claim that it has become more accurate. Let's listen to Brett Weinstein, the evolutionary biologist, the scientist, tell us how exit polling fake data makes it impossible to audit our elections. Now, if he is running the most genius info op where he purposefully says the most retarded things imaginable, then cheers to him. Fantastic performance, and I will owe him an apology that I will be happy to deliver. But I've paid attention to Brett Weinstein for 8 or 9 years now. I've followed him on Twitter. I feel at least a little confident that I know how he thinks and I understand where his mind's at and how he got there. I've interacted with him on Twitter before. He's not awake. And I'm not saying he's a terrible person, but responsible people cannot look at this and think, yes, this helps. However many millions of people in Rogan's audience who have not heard Rogan's guests or Rogan talk in a serious way about election fraud in almost 4 years do not need to hear that it's true, but happened in an impossible and nonsensical way.
Right. Because for one thing, elections used to be different, as you remember, right? First of all, you used to vote in person, and voting by mail was something you were very reluctant to do because you knew that if your vote got counted, it was going to be very late in the process. It wasn't really going to matter.
It was mostly for soldiers serving overseas.
Right, exactly. It was for people who just simply couldn't vote in person, and it never really mattered except in very rare cases. The disappearance of that and the normalization of voting by mail, the normalization of voting across a period of time so that you're not all voting on the same day, and the absence of exit polls, right? When everybody's voting from home or wherever, you can't detect fraud by virtue of the fact that the count that came in from that precinct didn't match what the exit pollers registered.
Right.
And so, I don't think we are wrong to imagine that we have lost the ability to check whether an election is fair and that that's not an accident. That leaves the possibility open to cheat. And as you point out, they cheat in every other way. Are we supposed to believe that they won't do that because their patriotism is so deep? I don't see any patriotism to them at all.
The person who just said that has spent the last 4 years pretending that Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes, or if he didn't, there's just no way to know and nothing we can do about it. So Joe Biden is the president and all of you are conspiracy theorists. Now, I'm not saying everybody out there has to believe in Q or devolution. That's everyone's own choice. But isn't it weird that all of these people who think they are the smartest people on earth, the most serious people, Eric Weinstein, in an interview just the other day, said that he thought it was the responsibility of him and others to be information gatekeepers because people just couldn't handle information. They ignored and convinced other people to ignore Q and devolution and anything in that world. They prevented themselves from even trying to understand an entire body of knowledge because they understood that it would endanger their platform and their reputation among their peers. Eric Weinstein in that interview made the point that he went into a college professor's office. Every time he does it, they'll close the door behind him. Oh, it's time to talk in secret now. And they'll say, you have no idea how bad it is here. Eric Weinstein's been telling that story for 7, 8, 9 years. Who cares? Think about how cowardly that is. All of these people think that it's important for them to keep their prestigious roles and maintain their reputation, so they can't even say in public that things have maybe gone off the rails a little bit at American universities. And Eric Weinstein thinks they're bold. Eric Weinstein, by the way, is the close advisor of Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel owns J.D. Vance, or owned J.D. Vance. Now, if these people are involved in a quote-unquote white hat information operation designed to wake up the normies, someday they'll be ready and then catch up. So be it. Maybe that's it, and this content is just not for us. It's meant to reach another group of people who are unable still to hear anything true unless it happened 4 or 5 years ago and all of the terrible consequences of them not knowing that thing have already happened. So they can just say, oh, well, I guess I wish I knew that, but I didn't. And hey, here we are. I guess we made it through another one. Every time that happens, it is them accepting knowledge that they were told about prior and rejected. And they think it's just fine because the smartest people in the world were fooled about it too. And of course, then they're referring to their favorite podcast hosts who in truth do nothing more than proclaim their feelings about what they saw on television. And then they quote unquote debate one another about their feelings based on competitive memorization and regurgitation of the totally made up details of whatever scandalous issue they're discussing. I am open to being wrong, and I am hopeful that I am wrong. But if you ask me, that is not an op to wake the normies up. It's an op to keep normies asleep and put people who believe they aren't normies back to sleep. But let's get into Benny Johnson, Dave Rubin, and Tim Pool. And to do that, I want to go through Merrick Garland's statement yesterday. He had a press conference that was broadcast on Fox News and other networks, which means that a signal is meant to be widely delivered, and you will hear Merrick Garland attempt to quickly deliver 3 different signals before getting into the meat of what he's actually talking about. He's cementing 2 other official stories within the central narrative and then moving on to his subject matter. The subject matter is why all of the press is there and why it's being broadcast on places like Fox News. At least that's the ostensible reason. But that's not what we actually got, and that should call into question the choices made by Fox News. I don't often see them break into the news day for breaking news. Let's go to Merrick Garland as the DOJ announces another child trafficking bust. But the beginning of the Russian collusion hoax narrative number 2, that's must-see TV. Here is Merrick Garland, the fake and illegitimate administration's Attorney General, laying down the law.
Threats Task Force to respond to a dangerous increase in violent threats against the public servants who administer our elections. We did so because countless Americans were enduring terrible threats simply for doing their civic duty. And we did so because threats to election workers constitute threats to our democracy itself. In just a few minutes, the task force here will meet to discuss its continuing work in advance of the upcoming election. But before we begin, I want to address the tragic shooting that occurred this morning at a high school in Winder, Georgia. We are still gathering information, but the FBI and ATF are on the scene, working with state, local, and federal partners. I'm devastated for the families who have been affected by this terrible tragedy. The Justice Department stands ready to provide any resources or support that the Winder community needs in the days ahead. Before I get to the work of the task force, I also want to announce 2 major law enforcement actions that the Justice Department is taking that are separate from the important work of this task force, but are part of our broader effort to protect our elections from unlawful interference of any kind. First, this morning we unsealed an indictment in the Southern District of New York of Konstantin Kalashnikov and Elena Afanasieva, 2 Russian-based employees of RT, a Russian state-controlled media outlet. They are charged with conspiring to commit money laundering and to violate the Foreign Agents Registration Act. That law, enacted nearly a century ago, was enacted to ensure that the American people were informed when a foreign power engages in political activities or seeks to influence public discourse. The American people are entitled to know when a foreign power is attempting to exploit our country's free exchange of ideas in order to send around its own propaganda. The company never disclosed to the, and that is what we alleged happened in this case. In the wake of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, RT, which was then known as Russia Today, was dropped by its American distributors. The company ceased its formal operations in the United States, and the European Union, the UK, and Canada banned RT's broadcasting. But as RT itself has boasted, the government of Russia continued to use RT to direct disinformation and propaganda. In the wake of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, RT's editor-in-chief said the company had built, quote, an entire empire of covert projects designed to shape public opinion in Western audiences. We allege that as part of that effort, RT and its employees, including the defendants, implemented a nearly $10 million scheme to fund and direct a Tennessee-based company to publish and disseminate content deemed favorable to the Russian government. To implement this scheme, the defendants directed the company to contract with U.S.-based social media influencers to share this content on their platforms. The subject matter and content of many of the videos published by the company were often consistent with Russia's interest in amplifying U.S. domestic divisions in order to weaken U.S. opposition to core Russian interests, particularly its ongoing war in Ukraine. The company never disclosed to the influencers or to their millions of followers its ties to RT and the Russian government. Instead, the defendants and the company claimed that the company was sponsored by a private investor. But that private investor was a fictitious persona. The charges unsealed this morning do not represent the end of the investigation. It remains active and ongoing.
All right, so before we get into the content, it's important to understand that to Merrick Garland's left sits FBI Director Chris Wray, and to his right sits one of the major players from Russian Collusion Hoax #1, Lisa Monaco. She's here for round 2 in all of its silliness and fakery. So consider that Merrick Garland starts out with a warning about violence against election officials that is supposedly going to be carried out by Trump supporters. Now, to the extent that anyone actually is physically threatening to harm election workers, well, that's terrible. But saying mean things on social media does not constitute a physical threat of violence in nearly every case. And there's no reason to believe there's a pattern of that because we have seen how things like this have been handled before. If you say you should be prosecuted for this crime and thrown in prison to a prominent communist online, that constitutes a threat of potential violence in their framing. That is totally normal, fair political speech. If you cannot say to a public official, I believe you have committed crimes in your position or in your office, and I think you should be prosecuted and imprisoned, then we have abandoned our First Amendment and our understanding of the relationship between the government and the people. Public servants are supposed to serve the public. The public is under no requirement to think that their public servants are doing a good job or have some crazy reverence for public officials. If you took your car to a mechanic and your mechanic set your car on fire and said, sorry, you don't have a car anymore, no one expects you to respond by saying, okay, that's cool. Let me go out and get another car and I'll be right back and maybe you can fix that one. But you're not allowed to say bad things about politicians. Why? Because those are their politicians. They're not your public servants. They are the regime's salespeople. Their goal is to convince you that the regime's agenda is not only the best thing for you, it's what you asked for. It's like the science. You would understand it if only you were smarter. So the television broadcast begins, and then he announces to whoever's watching that Trump supporters are threatening election officials. That is election interference by the Department of Justice. That is the illegitimate Attorney General of global corporatist America telling the American public that Trump supporters are violent and plan to interfere in the election. This is the same thing they did in 2020. And they did it to such a degree that they staged an entire event around forcing Trump on the debate stage to tell the Proud Boys to stand down, insinuating that somehow Trump was commanding the Proud Boys. He ended up saying, "Proud Boys, stand back, stand by," repeating the words out of the mouths of Joe Biden and Chris Wallace, and then it became, "Trump tells Proud Boys to stand by, threat of violence higher than ever before." We're seeing it all over again. Garland moves from that to talking about this brand new school shooting event in a town called Winder, Georgia, making sure the public knows that it's on their minds, it's real, and everything that could ever be done about it is absolutely being done about it. Garland did not mention that the FBI had talked to the shooter, so we're in another one of those events. I would suggest that you disengage emotionally from that sort of content, because if patterns hold, that story will probably be blown up completely within the next 2 or 3 days. But even if somehow this one event is completely and totally true, what do they want you to do? Well, they want you to agree that guns should be taken away. Here is your example of why guns should be taken away. And that means that Kamala Harris, the communist, is not that scary. Sure, she wants to take your guns away, but it's for a good reason. You can see the good reason playing out on your television right now. And to be clear, it's entirely possible that someone was really activated and someone did go shoot up a school. But taking that for granted right now because the TV says so is crazy. And understanding that there were already connections between this supposed shooter and these federal agencies should make you take multiple steps back from this story and just wait and see what happened. The regime immediately began pursuing an agenda item they were already pursuing before, which means that their first action was to attempt to exploit this story. Therefore, they are not taking it seriously. You cannot then listen to them for all the details. They are saying clearly that they want to take people's guns. And it's no mistake that they paired that with a story about MAGA supporters threatening election officials. Those two stories were unrelated to the reason they held the press conference in the first place. And so is the third story, the Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, Benny Johnson story. Merrick Garland repeated over and over that this happened after Putin's brutal invasion into Ukraine. He bragged about the country taking down RT and then presented this operation as though it was some replacement for RT. The Americans took down the Russia Today network. Therefore, we're going to give $10 million to these 3 grifters to set up this new media company called Tenet Media. In his remarks, Merrick Garland brought up the Foreign Agents Registration Act. You know who probably violated that more times than just about anyone ever? Hunter Biden. But now it's being applied to some Russians who were funding Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, and Benny Johnson, allegedly. It all just lays out so perfectly. And what were these foreign actors trying to do? Well, they were trying to influence American media outlets to influence the belief systems of the audience. Merrick Garland is telling us that it is bad. Indeed, it is a crime for foreign entities to be broadcasting their version of how things are to an American audience and or using Americans to do that. Now, we've talked many times about the organization Voice of America. Tucker Carlson's dad used to run it. The whole point of Voice of America is to broadcast American propaganda around the world. All of those countries into which American propaganda is broadcast view us as a foreign country. So Merrick Garland is attempting to prosecute 3 Americans, and yes, they are sellouts and liars and frauds, but they're still 3 Americans. He's attempting to prosecute 3 Americans for something the American government does. And not only does the American government do it, it's standard practice for major American media companies to be in the exact same relationship with foreign actors. Many of them have foreign ownership. Fox News has foreign ownership. Rupert Murdoch is Australian. The outlet The Intercept was originally founded and funded by the founder of eBay, the Iranian Frenchman Pierre Omidyar, a globalist progressive billionaire. George Soros has all kinds of media influence in the United States and has for decades. There were headlines about George Soros just within the last few years buying Spanish language radio networks. The companies that advertise on major American media broadcast networks are all partners of the World Economic Forum. So they abide by the World Economic Forum's code of conduct, and they pursue the same agenda, which is the UN Agenda 2030, the Great Reset Agenda. And it shows not only in the false reality they try to create through their commercials and other advertisements, but also through the content itself. Mainstream American media content is even created, edited, and censored by foreign-aligned actors as well. The Trusted News Initiative was a project of the BBC. Mike Benz, just last week on Tucker Carlson, talked about how the American media and the central narrative they pump out every day, the official stories of each day, are produced through the Atlantic Council, which, as Tweeter Trash pointed out in the chat yesterday during the live stream, is downstream from NATO. All of our media is influenced by foreign actors, and we haven't even gotten to the Israel lobby yet. The control of the Zionist project in America, not only of the media, but of major companies, and of course, all our politicians. That's not me saying that. That's real Congressman Thomas Massie talking about how there are very few politicians in the entire American federal government who are not just simply doing the bidding of AIPAC and the other Israel lobbies. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, is a Zionist leverage and censorship organization, and they directed the censorship of American citizens and influenced, to a large degree, what media outlets were allowed to print and what people were allowed to say online. So there are a few ways to look at this. Either the Justice Department is just totally corrupt and legitimately pursuing these three people and plans to legitimately prosecute them for taking $10 million from some unnamed source that is said to be a foreign actor, and it's a real-life example of our two-tiered system of justice. Or it's possible that these three actually took money from a foreign source. And maybe they did. I don't know. The claim is that they did it unwittingly and that they didn't know. But again, in my view, all three of these guys are liars, grifters, sellouts, and frauds, so it wouldn't surprise me in the least if they took money from foreign sources to constantly slander Trump and his supporters and mention every time their feelings are hurt or they think he should have done something a slightly different way. They went along with COVID. They went along with the vax. They went along with pretending that Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes. They went along with the very violent insurrection. They went along with the Ukraine war. They went along with the Israel war. So the fact that they say sort of mean things about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and say that they don't want them to be president and vice president anymore really doesn't mean anything. But then again, they are part of an info op. Could they be part of a good info op? It's possible. We have to allow for the possibility that this story is nothing more than a narrative device so that the people who would be otherwise inclined to interfere in any attempt by Donald Trump, the people around him, his supporters, etc., whatever the next version of the American government is, any attempt by those sorts of people to interfere with the process of accountability will have already heard the argument in principle from this case about why all of those things are very bad and may have made the arguments themselves. Their company, Tenet Media, just started, kind of came out of nowhere. They were doing live video coverage inside the halls of the Democrat National Convention. You remember how cool it was that Matt Walsh went in disguise. He wore a hat. No one could tell who he was. And sure, he was there to promote his latest anti-wokeness documentary. But boy, oh boy, did he trick those commies. They thought they were in the safe space, and all of a sudden, the destroyer of wokeness, Matt Walsh, appeared in disguise. Oh no, he's made it through all our defenses. But Tenet Media was there for the event, trying to get some of those Democrats and produce some viral content that goes out everywhere. They have a totally ridiculous website. where it looks like they all want to pretend to be in a goth band. And here they are soon after, maybe too soon after, the subject of this very serious DOJ indictment with this very serious, very legitimate attorney general who's definitely going to be around for more than just the next 2 months. I mean, honestly, how does it happen? No, seriously, how does it happen? How does something like this happen? This is the National Pulse today in their coverage. The headline, The Russian Propaganda Indictment and What It Means for Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, and Dave Rubin. And we're going to skip about halfway down in this. According to the indictment, Russian operatives approached a Tennessee-based media company, widely understood to be Tenet Media, offering to finance a social media operation primarily centered on YouTube videos addressing hot-button American political issues. However, as part of the financial agreement, Kalashnikov and Afanasieva would have a high degree of control over the content published. The two would use false identities in their interactions with content creators, directing them to unwittingly push Russian interests among more standard social media political commentary. Tenet Media is owned by Canadian national and right-wing social media personality Lauren Chen and her husband Liam Donovan. The DOJ indictment does not mention either by name, nor does it level criminal charges as of now against the couple. However, the charging document does allege that both Chen and Donovan were aware that they were working with and taking money from Russian operatives and appear to be complicit in pushing Russian propaganda, or at least that's what's alleged by the DOJ. And by the way, this announcement came a day after Tim Pool said that he intends to sue the very real Kamala Harris campaign because they put out a nasty tweet about him that said some of his claims were extreme, egregious, or outright psychotic. That made Tim Pool very, very mad. Mad enough to sue. But wait, Donald Trump makes claims like that about media figures all the time. Should he be sued? Does Tim Pool believe in principle that Donald Trump should be sued for saying mean things about mainstream media, journalists, and other media figures? Because if he doesn't believe that, why would he then claim the right to sue Kamala Harris? If anything, she's giving Tim Pool street cred that he doesn't deserve. Tim Pool's claims are moronic. They're milquetoast. Everything he says is a desperate, groveling attempt to appeal to authority and an announcement that he's prepared to answer all of your quiz questions. Now, from an info-op aspect, that can't be overlooked. Tim Pool is playing it as though the DOJ's announcement was retaliation for him saying he was going to sue. And if all of this is a grand stage show and it is just an info-op, maybe he's telling the truth about that in a narrative sense. But you have to also leave open the possibility that Tim Pool knew that was going to be announced, and so he came and made these claims about suing the Harris campaign for defamation to shield himself. Maybe one day we'll know. Let's go back to the National Pulse. The indictment notes that while Tenet Media's leadership appeared willing to participate in the Russian influence scheme, the company's clients were unaware of the foreign connections. Tenet Media had relationships with a roster of conservative and right-leaning influencers, including Benny Johnson, Tim Pool, and Dave Rubin. A year ago, a media startup pitched my company to provide content as an independent contractor. Our lawyers negotiated a standard arm's-length deal, which was later terminated. Benny Johnson wrote in a post on X, formerly Twitter. He said, "We are disturbed by the allegations in today's indictment, which makes clear that myself and other influencers were victims in this alleged scheme." Dave Rubin posted on X, formerly Twitter, "These allegations clearly show that I and other commentators were the victims of this scheme. I knew absolutely nothing about any of this fraudulent activity, period." Rubin also said the DOJ never contacted him regarding the investigation or the subsequent indictment, which, assuming he's telling the truth, leads to the understanding of all of this as a stage show, a farce, an info-op meant to convince the Trump-deranged people out there that everything Merrick Garland just named is actually something that people, that journalists, should be prosecuted for. And they will have made those arguments loudly, publicly, and maliciously setting up an obvious boomerang and backlash for when all of this is being pursued in the other direction. And it seems like this has to be the proper read on this situation. Interestingly, none of them seem to be denying that the money actually did come through. And then you would have to suspect that they actually did amend their content when requested by the people with money. Now, I don't think that should be a crime, but once you understand that to be true, taking these people at their word is pretty difficult to do. But again, it's possible that the whole thing is a farce and these guys are playing along and doing exactly what they're told. Maybe they're just fantastic performers who have not broken character for 9 years and have consistently been wrong in the same way about virtually everything the whole time. That would be a monumental performance by each of them. Seems like that's probably not it, but hey, you never know. David Sachs, the very rich, very prominent tech normie on X, formerly Twitter, who is himself a very serious intellectual. He was the host of the Ron DeSantis campaign announcement event on Twitter Spaces back in May of last year, a full 7 months after his ritual humiliation of a fake presidential primary campaign was actually exposed to the public when Donald Trump said "desanctimonious" for the first time. Sachs is also a friend of Elon Musk and host of the All In podcast, which features 4 rich tech bro normies talking about how they feel about what's on Twitter that day. They hosted Donald Trump for an interview just a couple of months back. The most insufferable of the 4 of them is a man named Jason Calacanis, who goes by @Jason on X, formerly Twitter. He posted on there yesterday, Putin wants chaos, and the media and partisans like Sachs want to make Putin's interference political. And yes, Putin bad. Putin, very brutal dictator, very bad. Tim Pool and Dave Rubin agree that Putin very bad. Well, David Sachs quoted this post and responded, "Nobody has spread more chaos than you. For years, you supported the Russiagate hoax against Trump. You may still believe it." And he writes these in bullet points. When the Tenet Media story broke, you immediately smeared several conservative podcasters as being Russian agents, even though the indictments made clear that they were lied to and didn't know. He goes on. When it turns out that Tenet Media was agitating against Trump, you changed your longtime story from, quote, Russians want Trump to win, end quote, to Russians are trying to sow chaos. Of course, you cannot consider the possibility that Putin may prefer the weak and ineffectual Kamala Harris. And he says your calls for unity ring hollow given your baseless smears of other podcasters and ongoing McCarthyism toward anyone who criticizes America's disastrous proxy war in Ukraine. And so this is how very serious intellectuals on Twitter still talk and still think. They are arguing about issues that were easily resolved and settled 2.5 years ago in the mind of any rational person who could assess the situation objectively and look at all of the fakery involved. The ghost of Kyiv, Snake Island, CNN footage of soldiers holding wooden guns. It was ridiculous. Not as ridiculous as paragliding go-karts, but pretty ridiculous. The fact that they're still having this argument in late 2024 is insane. This is what it is to be trapped in the normie sphere. This is what it is to be sat at the intellectual kids table and refuse to move and refuse to ever say the no-no words. They all argue about the same nonsense, avoiding the correct answers completely until way down the line. And in doing that, in an environment they know to be censored, they have all made themselves severely retarded. And by the way, Putin did endorse Kamala Harris today. It came right after the DOJ's announcement. They want to make everybody think that Russia is meddling in the election to help Donald Trump. Well, Putin comes out and trolls the entire thing and shows how ridiculous it all is. He said, if we can name a favorite candidate, it used to be Joe Biden. Now he's not participating in the election campaign, and he recommended to all his allies to support Kamala Harris. So that is what we are going to do. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said now everyone should fall in love with Kamala Harris's laugh. Does it seem like the Russian government takes Joe Biden and Kamala Harris seriously? Does it seem like they believe Joe and Kamala are really president and vice president? Vladimir Putin is so comfy cozy that he makes a grand display of visiting Mongolia in violation of the arrest warrant handed down by the totally illegitimate and impotent International Criminal Court. The next day, the DOJ announces indictments against Russian individuals and entities for interfering in American elections, and then Putin comes out and endorses Kamala Harris. And not to go too far aside, but that's not the only major endorsement Kamala landed in the last day. She also got the endorsement of Liz Cheney. You see that? The Uniparty just right out there on display, loud and proud. Someone pulled up this tweet from Liz Cheney in 2020. She said Kamala Harris is a radical liberal who would raise taxes, take away guns and health insurance, and explode the size and power of the federal government. She wants to recreate America in the image of what's happening on the streets of Portland and Seattle. We won't give her the chance. So I guess she's changed her mind now. Liz Cheney, the very powerful, very serious rock-ribbed conservative, now since the 2020 election and the very violent insurrection and everything that followed, well, she's reconsidered her stance, and now she understands that Donald Trump is the most dangerous thing to ever happen to anyone anywhere. And because he's so bad, it's now better to raise taxes, take away guns and health insurance, and explode the size and power of the federal government. Those are her words about what Kamala would do. Now she accepts all that because Trump is so bad. Why would anyone ever believe that these people cared about those things in the first place? Their number one priority is serving and preserving the global regime and the current uniparty power structure in the United States of America. That has always been the priority. They represented it under one brand. Now they're representing it under the other brand. And what are they telling everybody? I didn't leave the right left me, just like Dave Rubin on the left. But let's return to Merrick Garland. We've made it through the three things he wanted to make sure the nation could hear about before he got to the actual subject matter of that task force and that press conference. Ostensibly the reason why the whole thing is happening in the first place. But it's not what they set up at the beginning once the television broke away from whatever they were talking about to cover this very important breaking news. Here's the heart of the matter.
In a separate enforcement action, the Justice Department is seizing 32 internet domains that the Russian government and the Russian-sponsored actors have used to engage in a covert campaign to interfere and influence the outcome of our country's elections. As alleged in our court filings, President Vladimir Putin's inner circle, including Sergei Kirilnikov, directed Russian public relations companies to promote disinformation and state-sponsored narratives as part of a program to influence the 2024 U.S. presidential election. An internal planning document created by the Kremlin states that as a goal of the campaign is securing Russia's preferred outcome in the election. The online infrastructure used by the Russian public relations company known as the Social Design Agency, or SDA, and related actors included what are sometimes referred to as cyber-squatted domains. These websites were designed to appear to American readers as if they were major U.S. news sites like the Washington Post or Fox News. But in fact, they were fake sites. They were filled with Russian government propaganda that had been created by the Kremlin to reduce international support for Ukraine, bolster pro-Russian policies and interests, and influence voters in the United States and in other countries. Internal documents of the Kremlin describe the content as, quote, bogus stories disguised as newsworthy events, close quote. This malign influence campaign has been referred to as doppelganger. The Russian public relations companies drove viewers to these websites by deploying influencers and paid social media advertisements. They also created fake social media profiles, posing as U.S. citizens, to post comments on social media platforms with links to the sites. According to SDA's records, it actively sought to, quote, eliminate the possibility of detection of the Russian footprint. Both of the schemes I have just discussed make clear the ends to which the Russian government, including at its highest levels, is willing to go to undermine our democratic process. But the enforcement actions I have discussed also make clear that the Justice Department will aggressively counter such efforts. And the same is true of the entire United States government. Today, our colleagues at the State and Treasury Departments are announcing parallel actions in both of these matters. Unfortunately, we know that Russia is not the only foreign power seeking to interfere in our elections. As the U.S. intelligence community noted 2 weeks ago, we have observed increasingly aggressive Iranian activity during this election cycle. That includes recently reported activities by Iran to compromise former President Trump's campaign and to avoid an election outcome that it regards as against its interests. Those recently reported Iranian activities also include efforts to obtain access to individuals who themselves have access to the presidential campaigns of both political parties. The Justice Department's message is clear. We have no tolerance for attempts by authoritarian regimes to exploit our democratic system of government. We will be relentlessly aggressive in countering and disrupting attempts by Russia and Iran, as well as China or any other foreign malign actor to interfere in our elections.
So Merrick Garland is accusing Russia of setting up fake news websites and then using influencers to spread their messaging. This is an anti-mis, dis, and malinformation operation. We may quickly see all of this reroute back to Telegram, the so-called Russian platform that they would then use whatever power they might have to shut down in America to prevent any dissent from their regime's agenda from spreading online. They certainly don't want people talking about how elections are fake, not before the fake election and not after the fake election. We are very, very close to the American public at large understanding in a way that they will support loudly and vocally in public that we don't have real elections. That is an inevitable conclusion to this process. People will understand that. And it's funny that the regime is now pushing all of these lines itself, and we'll continue along those lines tomorrow. But it's also necessary to understand that Merrick Garland is talking about foreign interference in American elections, the subject matter through and through of Executive Order 13848, signed by Donald Trump on September 12th of 2018, and still in effect today. Joe Biden renewed it in 2021, 2022, and 2023, and it seems a near certainty that he will renew it within the next week for one more year. The public has to know that all of these things are bad and that Joe Biden fully agrees with the policy set forth in Executive Order 13848. In fact, it's entirely possible that he agrees with it so hard, he might even attempt to use it against Donald Trump. But as with everything else, what matters is the court of public opinion, and nobody's going to believe that. The story today is going viral about Vladimir Putin saying that he wants Kamala Harris to win this fake election. He had said Joe Biden before that. And why? What was his rationale? Well, he said they would be very consistent and predictable. And of course they would. They're implementing the global regime's agenda. Putin has a very clear understanding of what the global regime's agenda looks like. He can see it in motion. It's not even a prediction. They tell everybody what they're doing. But the deeper knowledge, of course, would be that Joe Biden's not a real president. Kamala Harris is not a real vice president. They clearly don't exercise the full power and authority of that office. And more importantly, they can't make any decisions in the first place. So what are they going to do? Change their mind? Hilariously, the godless philosopher king of Klaus Schwab's technocratic communist dystopia, Yuval Noah Harari, suggested that we don't even really need politicians anymore. Computers will just run everything. It'll just be AIs talking to other AIs, deciding what's happening. Humans will never even need to know.
You still have democracies with people voting for this president or this prime minister. But if most of the decisions are made by AIs and humans, including the politicians, have difficulty understanding the reason why the AIs are making a particular decision, then power will gradually shift from humanity to these new alien intelligences.
Alien intelligences?
Yeah, I prefer to think about AI. I know that the acronym is artificial intelligence, but I think it's more accurate to think about it as an alien intelligence, not in the sense of coming from outer space, in the sense that it makes decision in a fundamentally different way.
So that's reassuring, isn't it? You can essentially already assume elements of that have been implemented. We may not be fully there, but we're on the way. And regardless, the point is, the decisions are not at any point made by the people. The decisions are made top down from a centralized and centralizing authority. He almost could not be clearer in saying that the identity of the politicians themselves, that doesn't matter at all. He's suggesting that going out and voting in elections would itself be a simulation. It would just be the people going out and participating in that ritual to suggest that they like one brand of the same thing better than the other brand. Coke wins or Pepsi wins, Chevy wins or Ford wins, Republican or Democrat wins. It doesn't matter because the same agenda is going to be implemented either way. None of the politicians have any decision-making power. They're essentially just figureheads. And that's not just going to happen in an AI world. That's how it already is now. They don't care what you vote for. The act itself is little more than a society-wide self-delusion. But he goes on.
After reading your new book, Nexus, I wanted to ask you a slightly modified question, which is, do you still believe that 10 years from now, humans will fundamentally be running the world?
I'm not sure. It depends on the decisions we all take in the coming years, but there is a chance that the answer is no. That in 10 years, algorithms and AIs will be running the world. I'm not having in mind some kind of Hollywoodian science fiction scenario of one big computer kind of conquering the world. It's more like a bureaucracy of AIs, that we will have millions of AI bureaucrats everywhere, in the banks, in the government, in businesses, in universities, making more and more decisions about our lives. That everyday decisions, whether to give us a loan, whether to accept us to a job, and we will find it more and more difficult to understand.
The machine will make decisions. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. You'll also do nothing and you'll be happy. And you know what? If you're not happy, you're not going to be around anymore because the AI by then will have realized that you are, as Yuval Noah Harari describes his words, a useless eater. And how would you get out of a situation like that? Would you follow the rules as hard as you possibly could, hoping over time you or maybe your progeny might attain a position of power in that system so great that eventually you might be able to fix that system working only within the rules? Or would you just realize, hey, if everyone stops obeying these rules, then the rules stop mattering. And the people in power aren't actually exercising any power or authority. They're just the public face of an agenda that is being implemented outside of their control by a number of faceless bureaucrats, probably operating as now some cyborg function of this very machine. Do we really have to obey these people? Do we have to obey their rules? And it turns out that no, you don't. And the way out of this is to stop complying with the rules. The rules aren't unjust and impractical and immoral by accident. They're set out that way intentionally to demoralize the public so that they can be intimidated. And once they're intimidated, they'll obey. And if everybody's obeying, well, then you can just listen to the machine whir. And I mean, at least the rules apply to everyone equally. The machine would never make different rules for different people. And then all of a sudden you remember, oh yeah, they wanted our social credit score on our digital vaccine ID. And our central bank digital currency would be there too. And once they get that far, well, it doesn't matter anymore if the rules don't apply equally to everybody. You'll get your own set of rules, and it'll be based on your own behavior. But that's in the future. So why wait? We could just make different rules for different groups right now. And some groups are claiming to want that. Here is Kamala Harris with a bunch of black men in the necessary cliche environment of a barbershop conversation. Kamala Harris is visiting the black community. Where does the black community hang out? Down at the barbershop. So if you want to hang out with the black community on television, you go to a barbershop. There are always TV cameras in black barbershops, which is why everyone you know who really appeals to the black community films scenes at barbershops.
And we're talking about specifically something that happens to black people here in America. So we have to be specifically targeting to help those people. Because we put those people in a position, and everybody knows the history. Yeah. Everybody understands the history of America. That's right. America, you did this to these people. You should write laws for these people. Don't group us in with everybody, because everybody didn't happen to everybody. But let's be fair. We playing from behind the eight ball. We way back there, 400 years back there. We're not asking y'all to give us nothing. We actually write the law. Those of us who are willing and able to do the work, will do the work. That's right. That's what we need. That's right.
Now, this video is posted in the info stream on Telegram, t.me/very reasonable. Just search barbershop with the search feature and have a look at this for yourself. But they don't even seem to be in a real barbershop. It looks like an empty retail space, and they shipped in like 7 barbershop chairs that they set up in a semicircle so that they could film this scene. And they put some hair products right in front of an exit door. But there's no mirrors. There's no hair cutting stations. It doesn't look like anyone's ever in there. It's very weird. But that man, that black American man, just made the argument that on the basis of oppression, you know, the old Marxist playbook, black Americans need special rules written for them. Now, that guy does not speak for all black Americans. I would imagine many, if not most, black Americans have some pre-built understanding that unequal systems of justice for black people and other people may not be the best idea. But the fake vice president who's pretending to run for president in this fake campaign for the next fake election doesn't seem to know. She just goes along saying, that's right, in her black-sounding accent. And if all of this was real, and they were fully in control, this would be very demoralizing. It would be very intimidating. It would seem like quite a daunting task to ever make our way out of this. But it's not all real, and they're not fully in control. In fact, there's no point at which it has ever looked like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were actually running the country. And the public at large knows that now. Those questions are asked by mainstream reporters to members of the fake administration. Who is running the country? Because they can tell no one is. And then they hear that people aligned with that agenda say it doesn't matter in the first place. We're running the country. You don't need your politicians to run the country. Sit back and pay attention to Taylor Swift. We'll let you know when something important happens and when you need to believe something or else get in trouble. And oh yeah, it turns out that the PR contract setting out the details for the fake relationship between Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, well, they leaked onto the internet, and now Travis and Taylor are taking legal action against this real PR contract setting out the details of their fake relationship. They're supposed to break up at the end of the month. Maybe the TV will tell us they've kept it going and ironed everything out so that we believe it's real. But it's not real. And it wasn't real in January when I did an episode of this podcast on that exact subject. That was a conspiracy theory back then, so people ignored it. It's not a conspiracy theory anymore. So why did those people, by choice, make themselves wrong for 7 months? And who told them that they were thinking about things in the right way? There was nothing else they needed to know or consider, because it was the conspiracy theorists, the people you shouldn't listen to, who were making all those claims about how Travis and Taylor's relationship was made up. It was a PR stunt. Well, it turns out the normies lost another one every single time. Isn't that amazing? And they just keep saying things as though they are on the cutting edge. They are continually months behind or years behind, and people keep listening. The same people on the same platforms as 2020, while everyone else remains censored. And again, all of that stuff would be very scary, demoralizing, intimidating, if it was real, if it was current, and if they had power. But it's not real, it's not current, and they don't have power. They're being mocked openly by other world leaders. Other world leaders who we're told they're at war with, and they're impotent to respond. Some fake DOJ indictments? Putin just endorsed Kamala Harris to blow up exactly these narratives. This isn't scary. You're being shown the answers because that timeline has folded back on itself. We are reaching the end of this phase. As I said, we will continue along these lines tomorrow. I will be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.